We're now on Facebook.
I just am putting us on Facebook. Why? It's actually, or I'm actually early, but I did it as we were getting ready for Facebook. Hey everybody. And I'm going to start recording in a second too. Mike, are you there? You come on. Don't know who. Yeah, Mike's on there. Hey there, Mike.
Hey, Rabbi.
What are you guys doing today?
We're here.
Sorry, they lost their puppy yesterday. Well, not their puppy, but their dog for
He was their
many
puppy.
years. Call him their puppy. Yeah. So we're sorry about losing Simba yesterday for 13, almost 14 years.
Yeah.
So Lisa's coming on.
Hello.
Hi there. So it's good we got Rosemary back with us today, and people are joining us. We were off last week, so I kind of really missed studying this where we're at right now. It's some very famous Midrash and some really important, well, it's all important, but there's some really important stuff that we're going to be looking at today, and yeah, it's pretty important. We already have people joining us on Facebook. So
How's your back, Mr. Rabbi?
it's better. It's better. Yeah. I
have this picture in my mind of what you told me yesterday, and it's really pretty funny.
I actually got a massage yesterday afternoon for like an hour. I had somebody walking on my back. It's a really good place, actually. It's over by where Chabad is, over on Lyons, and in that shopping center. And it was pretty brutal, but I really needed it because I was definitely out of sorts, and I could barely. My wife said to me yesterday, "You're not even walk. You can't even walk." And yeah, they fixed it, so that was good. I mean, it wasn't good before I fell down. Rosemary, I was chasing my dog down the hill. Or at least I was chasing my dog, and I slipped and fell in front of my neighborhood as I was running after my dog Sunday morning or Saturday morning. So,
but what were you wearing?
I was wearing I said thongs, but flip-flop. I was wearing flip-flops.
I understood.
So I slipped down the hill, and dog was making me run around like a maniac because he was embarrassed. I mean, the dog was embarrassing me too, because he not only was he not listening to me, he was trying to get in other people's yards. So I was doing my best not to wake people up Saturday morning, but it was like everyone was starting to wake up and people were walking, and it was like right at the wrong time. I took him out to go to the bathroom, like right as, like if no other dogs are out or no other people's out, he's fine. But once other people start coming out and there's other activity, then it's a problem. So when I walked out, there wasn't anybody else, but all of a sudden people were walking, and it was the whole thing, and the dog just went crazy. And I mean, I was wearing thongs and sweat. I mean, it was I know pajama bottoms. I wasn't even wearing sweats. I think they were, technically those were pajamas. Anyways, everyone was walking around in pajamas up until a couple of days ago, but I think people are I think pajamas are not going to be acceptable forms of clothing pretty soon. So I think we might be getting back to normal pretty well. Definitely traffic is getting back to normal here in LA. I'll tell you that. Friday was really like a normal Friday afternoon. So I think we're getting back to normal, unfortunately. Was hoping that somehow there were not going to be people going back to work in their cars, but
when did you get back to from Utah last week?
We got back Thursday night. But even Thursday night when we came back from the airport, from LAX, it was back to, I mean, we got in at a bad time. We got in at like 4:00, but it was bad. It was a bad drive. But Friday was really bad. And Friday was bad. So it looks like things are returning to normal. And tonight we have Yom HaZikaron. We have the first part of Israel's national holidays. We have Israel Memorial Day for the soldiers and traditionally people who've fallen also in terrorist attacks and people who kind of have died for the nation of Israel, the state of Israel. So yeah, people have been added to that who weren't necessarily combatants, if you will, people who've died in, shopping malls and pizza parlors and buses have been added to Yom HaZikaron as well. And there's an alarm that goes off tonight in Israel. Actually, usually 2 alarms that go off that people stop and pull their cars over even for when they're observing Yom HaZikaron. And then the next day, Wednesday, is Yom HaSmut, Israel Independence Day, which is 73rd year of Israel's existence that we're celebrating this year. And Israel is trying to figure out ways to celebrate in the midst of, again, even though they're the most vaccinated country in the world, I think right now, they're still figuring out ways to celebrate in a not normal time. And of course, Israel is also trying to figure out how to celebrate when they're in the midst of their 5th election or their whatever. It's who knows when this election chaos is going to end there, because they did not have a definitive, as of now, answer to who's going to be their government. So there you go. That's what's going on in Israel. But they definitely want to celebrate Israel's miracles and the things that have been going on in Israel. So we're hoping that Judith just texted me that she's coming on. She wants us to stall or not. I'm not stalling for Judith because Rosemary's actually reading today, but I am just reminding people that there is stuff going on this week. We posted up some of the things that we have. I'm also going to be posting a greeting from the Consul General, who's a friend of mine, Dr. Hillel Newman. I'm going to post a greeting that he just did for us for the holidays of Israel. And I posted some links to some of the things that the consulate is doing virtually this year for Yom HaSmut, because there's not going to be any of the gatherings, big public gatherings for Israel, either in Los Angeles or New York or some of the other places. In Israel, obviously they're going to do some things, but it's going to be very low key, and it's not going to be encouraging people to come together. There'll be some national ceremonies and things like that, but not like normal. And in New York, for example, they do a big Israel Day parade around this time too, on one of the weekends around Yom HaSmut. They do a Israel parade, and like all the other parades that New York had to scrap, those will not be happening. By the way, I just was reading an article about 2 seconds before we started that this was on JTA about Cuomo. He didn't enjoy going to campaign appearances during Sukkot back in 2006. So I guess he was on record. I don't understand what the New York Times Magazine reported that Cuomo said back while he was running. I don't understand why this was a story now, but back in 2006, he was campaigning during Sukkot, and he said, "These people and their effing tree houses." It's kind of fun. I mean, it's offensive, but it's kind of funny in a way. I mean, it's not. It's just very New York, I guess, maybe. But the spokesman points out, who responded, his 2 sisters married Jewish men, and he has the highest respect for Jewish tradition, the spokesman said. Cuomo's relationship with the Jewish community has largely been positive for most of his career, but his ties with the Orthodox community hit a rough patch when he tightened restrictions during COVID, heightened COVID test positivity rates. Coincidentally or not, these restrictions were announced during Sukkot. So some people think he has a problem with Sukkot, but I don't know. That was the story in JTA today that
Like he would care that much about Sukkot.
I don't know. It's kind of funny. But anyways, it is very New York. So he's got a lot more problems than his problem with Sukkot, though. So if he has to step down, it won't be for his comments about Sukkot. I promise you that. But anyways, excuse me. So we're going to get started this morning. And gosh, I love Sukkot too. That's the kind of the scary thing is that's one of my favorite holidays. So my tree house.
Yeah, Rabbi, it gives you a chance to sit in the tree.
This is my tree house. I wish I had a tree house, by the way. I love tree houses. I would love to have a tree house, a literal tree house for Sukkot. Maybe one day if I'm celebrating in a tropical climate or somewhere, one of those places where they have really cool tree houses. That would be a cool thing. I like that. And anyways, from the ridiculous to the sublime, because today we're going to be turning back towards, and I'll look for people as they still come in. I know there's people still joining us. Hey, Jeff Stein, are you okay? Jeff, you there? You awake? Jeff, you're muted.
You did.
You're muted.
There.
Yeah,
We're good. Yeah, we're good.
all right.
We're looking for Dave's coming out here later this month. It's been
Excellent.
about 2 weeks. We're very excited about that.
Excellent. Well,
Yeah.
just remember something. Dodgers are playing the Rockies tonight. So
Yeah, you Rockies are going to lose, Jeff.
Jeff,
I hope so.
Jeff's Rockies are not a Rocky. He's not a Rocky fan.
I fight my 295 flag every day.
Yeah, you'll get to see him what's the situation, by the way, at Coors Field? Are they letting people in?
Yeah, limited percentage amount.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, I hope to be going to Dodger Stadium soon. So
Yeah.
that will be part of getting back to normal. So
Yeah.
yes, we're playing the Rockies tonight after having finally a day off. So we're going to be reading about Moses. We left off 2 weeks ago talking about Moses in chapter 18 of Exodus. We have this reunification of Moses and Zipporah, his wife. We don't know when they separated, which I think would have made the news in Egypt, but it didn't make the Torah news. It would have been a people story on you'd think, but it didn't make the Torah. All of a sudden, we read in chapter 18 that Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, and if you recall, it says his name like every time it says Yitro, the father-in-law of Moses. That's like his name. That's like his last name, father-in-law of Moses. He reunites them. And then he also takes a moment to look at the way Moses is leading the people and says, you're not doing it right. You gotta delegate authority. And so he encourages them. He encourages Moses to find those people, encourages him to find those elders to help judge. And that's where we left off. And so this is look, I mean, the Torah finds it necessary to tell us about this scene, if you will, kind of in a really important place, because chapter 16, they're crossing the Sea of Reeds and kind of finding that they want to have, well, water and food, and the manna story, pretty important, which leads then to the story of Amalek, where Israel gets attacked by the Amalekites and kind of all of a sudden now has had a battle which they didn't seem to be ready for. And now chapter 18 is the story of the elders and Yitro recommending the elders be appointed. And then the next chapter is Mount Sinai, literally like in the midst of some really dramatic scenes. unfolding, we get this weird digression into politics and delegation of authority, which is clearly important because it's here in the Bible and it's mentioned, but it's not like the rest of the things that are happening in a very large sense. And I guess you can make the argument it shows how important it is, because there is this digression or movement towards a very banal kind of, this is the way you got to delegate authority. But definitely not, it's definitely not a battle scene. It's definitely not a dramatic crossing of the Sea of Reeds, Mount Sinai, God in our midst scene. And that's where we're at. So the Midrash on this continues, and Rosemary, if you want to start here, where the people are very eager to carry out Moses, this plan of finding people, and again, capable, pious men to be judges and leaders over them. And so this is where we left off.
The people were very eager to carry this plan of Moses into execution and requested him to settle the matter as quickly as possible. But their motive was self-interested, for everyone among them said, Moses will now appoint about 80,000 officials. If I myself should not be among them, surely my son will be, and if not he, my grandson, and with a gift of some kind, it will be an easy matter to... You went away. What happened there?
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. It will be an easy matter to induce such a judge to look after my interests at court. Moses, of course, was not deceived about their true sentiments. Still, he paid no further attention to them and picked out the best men among the people, though they were not possessed of nearly all the good qualities Yitro had thought essential for judges and leaders of people. With kindly words, he invited them to assume their offices and said, Blessed are you that are judged worthy of being leader of the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of a people whom God called his friends, his brothers, his flock, and other titles of love. He impressed upon them that they must possess much patience and must not become impatient if a lawsuit is brought before them more than once. Heretofore, he said, you belong to yourselves, but from now you belong to the people. For you judge between every man and his brother and his neighbor. If you are to appoint judges, do so without respect of persons. Do not say, I will appoint that man because he is a handsome man, or a strong man because he is my kinsman, or because he is a linguist. Such judges will declare the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent, not through wickedness, but through ignorance. And God will reckon the appointment of such judges against you as a perversion of justice on account of your respect of persons. If a wealthy man and a poor man come before you to court, do not say, why should I insult the rich man for so small a matter? I will rather give judgment in his favor, and then outside the court, tell him to give the poor man what he demands, as he is in the right. But do not, on the other hand, if the poor man is in the wrong, say, the rich man is obliged to assist the poor anyhow. I will now decide in favor of the poor, that in a decent way he may, without begging, obtain money from his rich fellow man. Do not, moreover, say, I fear to pronounce judgment, lest that man kill my son, burn my barn, or destroy my plants. For the judgment is God's.
Yeah. What's so interesting about this description of the people that were being chosen was, first of all, it kind of just reflects that people haven't really changed a lot in 3,000 years.
It sounds very contemporary, this debate about judges and the influences on them.
Yeah. And this is unfortunate that we still haven't figured out a way to get beyond this. We haven't. There's nothing about this that doesn't ring true to us now. The issue here is that this appointment of judges is, when it first happens, is a mass appointment of judges. And so people are all thinking at the beginning, what we read is, oh, look, there's so many judges. that they have to appoint is that some of them are going to be my friends, or some of them are, I'm going to be able to get to. Some of them will be connected to me. So people were really excited because there was just so many of them. That being said, there's another issue, which is, and of course, there's kind of an understanding that, yeah, not everybody is going to meet the requirements that we're putting up there. But of course, then it kind of digresses to the other issue, which is that whenever you appoint a judge, whenever someone's put in that position, there's a risk. And there is all of the human emotions and fears and considerations that go into how people make their decisions. And of course, it's really scary because, even when they're doing work that's God's work, there's no guarantee that they're going to get it right. At least in picking the right people, and then of course what those people will do. Look, Judaism has an obsession with justice. I mean, we are obsessed as Jews with justice. I would say it's one of the things that kind of still motivates Jews when it comes to politics and when it comes to the decisions that we make. No matter almost what side of the political spectrum we're on, I think that desire to find justice is really paramount in our tradition, in our faith, in our behavior. Is that, and it's not just why so many Jews become lawyers and judges, but it's one of the reasons, again, that I think Jews are so politically motivated. And it's one of those issues that kind of galvanizes people together, is this feeling of a commitment to it, to make sure that courts are run right, that they're not perverted by power, that there's equal protection under the law. And it's one of the reasons why the United States has been such a great home for the Jewish people, is because we really do understand that this country is committed to those same values that we've had for thousands of years. The difference, of course, in Judaism is that we didn't have, and again, it wasn't just Judaism, it was about every ancient justice system, that it came down to the judge. In our system, it obviously oftentimes comes down to a jury. In ancient Israel, it would come down to judges, and sometimes, again, many times, to a tribunal, meaning literally three or more judges sitting on, sitting in the role of a decision, always odd numbers. Some courts go up even as high as 81 members in court, so that essentially you have a jury of judges rather than a jury of your peers, which obviously is why we call it a jury of your peers rather than a jury of professional jurists. And again, we still have grand juries. We still have panels that are essentially not made up of the normal people, if you will. If you've ever served on a jury before or ever been to court with a jury in a jury trial, you sometimes understand why having a jury of judges might be a better way of doing it. But of course, if you have a professional judge, or you have a constant, person or people that are judging things, that's how you get, you can still jury tamper and you can still pressure a jury, even if they're serving a singular time. But if it's a professional judge, there's an understanding, of course, that you could get in front of that judge and somehow bribe them or pressure them. And then if you know that these people are regularly judges, then you're going to help yourself. And look, there are cases of judges who've been convicted of accepting bribes, and there are judges who've completely abandoned their responsibilities to their community. But Judaism sees this as really one of the worst things that can happen. If you don't have a system of justice, then you're essentially society falls apart. So the reason that our tradition would say that this text is here in Exodus chapter 18 is because it is so important. It's like the 10 Commandments in that if you have laws and have no way of of implementing them, and if no way of having accountability, what's the purpose? What good is having the law? And it's something that Judaism has always had an issue with. It's actually a universal law. One of the laws of Noah is that you must have a court a system. You must have a justice system. So there's 7 laws that are incumbent on everybody, not Jews, universal laws. And the rabbis saw that one of those positions that they had, that like one of those non-negotiables, if you will, of a society is that it has to have a system of justice. It doesn't say like, they have to keep kosher. It doesn't say they have to, have Shabbat, but what people have to have, I mean, they can't have murderers, and there's a whole list of 7 things. They're not always, by the way, the same list, but one of the consistent ones is this one, which is a system of courts of justice. And again, one can make the argument Jews cannot live in a country. We cannot make ourselves at home in a place that doesn't have a system of justice. So just understand that this is really important for us. It's not an accident that this is here, and this stuff that you're reading about, the rabbis discuss. I mean, a good chunk of the Talmud, a good chunk of it, like I don't know what percentage, but it's a huge percentage, is essentially how to figure out how to render judgments, and even more so, how to create systems of judges that will be effective. And so there's entire tractates of the Talmud, Sanhedrin, for example, which is a huge volume, and then all the other parts of the Talmud that deal with the Babylonian Talmud that deal with court cases. It's the majority of the Talmud. I mean, it's, I have a Talmud set that's 72 volumes, meaning that, Sanhedrin, for example, is in 3 volumes, but there's 72 volumes of it. And I would say of the 72 volumes, half of it at least is nothing but civil court stuff, if you will. And then the rest is holidays and sacrifices and things like that, and a lot of midrash in the Talmud. But the sections on legal matters, enormous chunk of the Talmud. So I'm gonna read this little paragraph here.
After these admonitions, Moses instructed the new judges in legal procedure in both civil and criminal cases, and at the same time urged the people not to deny the judges the veneration due them. For great is the importance of justice. For him who hates it, there is no remedy, but the judge who decides conscientiously is the true peacemaker for the will of Israel, of the commonwealth, and indeed of all living creatures.
Yep. So there you get it. Again, for much of Jewish history, the rabbis functioned as judges. They did not function as spiritual leaders. They didn't function as chaplains. They didn't function as prayer leaders. They functioned as judges. And that's essentially what the rabbis themselves did. So the people who wrote this text saw themselves as judges. They saw themselves as legal scholars. They did not see themselves as what we see rabbis today. So when we use the word rabbi today, we oftentimes are speaking a different, it's different semantics. It's different meanings for what the term really means. The rabbis saw themselves as judges, and they saw themselves as people who are keeping the peace. Again, though, ironically, for most of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, that meant civil law. It did not mean criminal cases for the most part, because criminal cases in many, many ways were tried by the local country, the local magistrates or local country where the Jewish people lived. They didn't really have the ability to necessarily implement criminal cases or criminal punishment, but they sometimes did. Kind of depended on the country and on the time. In some cases, Jews had pretty much full autonomy over their own people, but for much of the time, for example, a Jew couldn't go to court with rabbis, for example, on a criminal case, whether it was rape or murder. They didn't go to the rabbis for those cases. They went to the local court in France or wherever it was, North Africa, and they were tried or punished in those communities that they lived in. But in some cases, the rabbis actually were responsible for criminal punishments and could impose death penalties or flogging or things that you would not think would be a part of their scope of work, but in some cases they did. It just kind of depended on the time and on the place. But for the most part, talking about civil law, we're talking about property issues, we're talking about marriage, family issues, that the rabbis did make this. They were empowered to make those decisions on, and still are in some countries where there kind of is a separation between marital or family law and civil or criminal law. So in some cases, rabbis are still making those decisions in some countries, primarily Middle Eastern countries where there aren't many Jews living anymore anyways, but there are places where that, and in Israel, it kind of is there's elements of what rabbis do there that move into the civil sphere, obviously, because in Israel there are no civil marriages. There are no only legal marriages in Israel from that standpoint. But so, for example, a rabbi has to give a bill of divorce in Israel, but essentially there are effectively ways not to kind of bypass the religious courts in Israel as well. So it's complicated a little bit in Israel today, but it's not horrific in the sense that there aren't ways around it in Israel. And there are essentially ways of holding people responsible for example, child custody and divorce and essentially payments for spousal support. The rabbis don't judge those things. So it's more about being able to be remarried later and being able to start a family or burial and those kind of issues that the rabbis have control over. But in some Middle Eastern countries, rabbis still have kind of power to even kind of get into spousal support and those kinds of things too. That's what a ketubah was. Originally, ketubah was a bill of spousal support. So Yitro was the one who introduced this, came to Moses' aid to kind of get him to do the right thing. Let's now talk about back to Yitro a little bit.
Although the installation of elders on Moses' part came to pass in accordance with the command of God, still it was Yitro upon whose advice Moses besought God to lighten his burden and to permit him partly to transfer the leadership of the people to others. Hence, he did not conceal the name of the advisor, but announced it to all the people and immortalized him as such in the Holy Scriptures, for he deemed it praiseworthy to appreciate duly the merits of others. It had, however, been part of God's scheme to reward Yitro for the love he bore the Torah, and for this reason, he allowed it to come to pass that Moses had to have his attention called to the plan of installing the elders through his father-in-law, that the Holy Scriptures might devote a whole chapter to the plan of Yitro.
Yep. And understand that Yitro is the name of the Torah portion that we read about getting the 10 Commandments. So this is a tremendous reward that this parsha, this Torah portion that we read back in February time. Can't even remember now. January. It was January. Yeah, or beginning of February. That week. That this was that Yitro gets this portion named after him. This is like the best portion you could get, and it's named after Yitro. Because it's one of the most important parts of the Torah is getting the 10 Commandments, and it's named after him. So it's a tremendous honor. It's the best billing you can get in Judaism. There's only 6 portions in the whole Torah, and all of the 50, it's actually 54 portions if you look at them all numerically laid out. There's only 6 named after people out of the 54. There's only 6. They usually come from the first few words, 5 or 6 words of the Torah portion. We'll find the name, right? There's only 6 named after people, 6. And one of them is Yitro. So that's a pretty good reward. But there's more. You get more.
This, however, is not the only reward for Yitro's piety, who in his love for the Torah excelled all proselytes. A miracle occurred on the very first day of his arrival in camp, for manna in his honor descended at the noon hour, the hour of his arrival, and moreover in as great quantities as was wont to rain down for 60 myriads of Israelites. He did not have to exert himself to gather the food, for it came over his body, so all he had to do was to carry it to his hand to his mouth to partake of it.
By the way, that doesn't sound so good. I mean, I guess he doesn't have to bend down to pick up the food, but to be covered in the food, that seemed to be a little sticky, but he gets food right on him. So he gets the manna right on him. He doesn't even have to bend over to pick it up. But that was right around this time. So right, this chapter before is manna, and now he's got manna comes with him. So that's another thing, but it's God's gift, so it can't be bad, right? So it's covered in manna.
It's an early example of Jews celebrating a special event with too much food.
Too much food, yeah, manna. Yep. And this is new, and this is for them, at least at this stage, it's not old stuff. It's brand new. It's all fun right now. We know later on, of course, well, not really much later on, but
well said, Judith.
Didn't take long for them to get sick of manna, but at this point, it's all good. But yes, he's covered in manna. All right.
Okay. Yitro, nevertheless, did not remain with Moses, but returned to his native land. Moses, of course, tried to persuade his father-in-law to stay. He said to him, "Do not think that we shall continue to move thus slowly through the desert. No, we shall now move directly to the promised land." Only to urge Yitro to stay longer with them did Moses use the words "we move," so that his father-in-law might believe that Moses too would enter the promised land, for otherwise he would hardly have allowed himself to be persuaded to join the march to Palestine. Moses continued, "I do not want to mislead you. Hence, I will tell you that the land will be divided only among the 12 tribes, and that you have no claim to possession of lands. But God bade us be kind to the proselytes, and to you we shall be kinder than to all other proselytes." Yitro, however, was not to be persuaded by his son-in-law, considering himself in duty bound to return to his native land. For the inhabitants of his city had for many years made a habit of having him store their valuables, as none possessed their confidence in such a measure as he. If he had stayed longer with Moses, people would have declared that he had absconded with all these things and fled to Moses to share it with him. And that would have been a blot on his fair name and that of Moses. Yitro had furthermore made many debts during the year in which he came to Moses, for owing to the hail God sent upon Egypt before the exodus of Israel, a great famine had arisen in Yitro's home too. And he had found himself obliged to lend money for the support of the poor. If he were not now to return to his home, people would say that he had run away in order to evade his creditors. And such talk concerning a man of piety would have been a desecration of the divine name. So he said to Moses, there are people who have a fatherland, but no property there. There are also property holders who have no family. But I have a fatherland and have property there as well as a family. Hence, I desire to return to my fatherland, my property, and my family.
So wait, just let's pause right there for a quick second. So this all is based on this question of why would Yitro go back after reuniting with Moses and seeing all the great things and hearing all the great things that were happening? How could he leave? First of all, he's got family. I mean, it's not like there's just because he likes Moses and Seaboard. I mean, there's his family. His grandkids are here now. They're on this great journey to the promised land. Great things are happening. And Moses essentially tells them, we're going to take care of converts there, or proselytes, which is, I'm not really sure if convert is necessarily the best word here, but definitely he's one who's attached himself to God. He seems to understand there is a God now, and he seems to get it. And he's either the Hebrew word for it is a ger, which means literally a stranger, but then develops into the word for a convert as well. So we use that word even today for a convert. It's a ger, which literally means stranger, or originally meant stranger, but today means a stranger among us, a person who lives in our midst, who may not have originally been Jewish, but now is, and definitely is part of the community. And Yitro definitely is that. He's a part of the community now. He's actually now proven himself indispensable, if you will, to the community. He's the one who came up with this great system here. And Moses says, it's going to be good if you come with us. And so the Midrash gives us some reasons why he can't, which is he's the guy, he's the bank for all the people. They trust him. And so they give all the stuff to him, and he takes care of it so that, it's a safety deposit box. He's their safety deposit, literally their safety deposit box. They trust him. He's also, it says, got huge debts, which he can't leave his debts behind. And why does he have debts? Because like everybody else, he lost his crops and he lost all this property during the hail, which didn't just affect Egypt, obviously, but according to this, but affected other places as well. And so he says, and then he says, look, I have a homeland. I actually have family. And again, according to the Torah, he had 6 other daughters and assumedly lots of other family there. So back in Midian. So he says, I gotta go back. But it does call into question, how does somebody who knows these great things are happening to the Jewish people, which it clearly says in the Torah, he knows, he gets it. How does he make this? How can he go back? And so this is, and I mean, literally, the guy just got, according to the Midrash, not in the Torah, but according to the Midrash, he gets covered in manna. I mean, he's seeing all this stuff firsthand. How could he possibly go back? It kind of, again, begs this question. How can you don't want to be a part of this? So that's where the rabbis are going with this. The Torah opened it up and said, he knows it. So how could he go back to just being Yitro back in Midian? So this is where this all comes from. Yep.
But Moses would not yield so soon and said to his father-in-law, if you do not accompany us as a favor, I will command you to do so, that the Israelites might not say that you had been converted to our religion only in the expectation of receiving a share in the promised land, but had returned to your home when you discovered that proselytes have no claim on property in the Holy Land. Through your refusal to move with us, you will give the heathens an opportunity to say that the Jews do not accept proselytes, since they did not accept even their own king's father-in-law, but allowed him to return to his own land. Your refusal will injure the glory of God, for the heathens will keep away from the true faith. But if you will wander with us, I assure you that your seed shall share with us the temple, the Torah, and the future reward of the pious. How can you, moreover, who have seen all the miracles God wrought for us during the march through the desert, who was a witness of the way in which even the Egyptians became fond of us, how can you depart now from us? It is a sufficient motive for you to remain with us in order to officiate as a member of the Sanhedrin and teach the Torah. We, on our part, want to retain you only that you might, in difficult cases, enlighten our eyes. For you were the man who gave us good and fair counsel, to which God himself could not refuse his assent.
So Moses is trying everything to negotiate with Yitro to stay. And one of the things that he says is that if you go back, the non-Jews are going to say, oh, Jews don't accept proselytes. They don't accept people who convert. And so it's going to make us look bad. It's going to make God look bad. We need you. You're the one who got this system of justice for us. You're a part of it. He actually says you're going to be a part of the Sanhedrin, the actual court. We need you, which, by the way, also shows, if you kind of read between the lines here, it's not really between the lines, it's all over the lines, that proselytes, according to this, could be part of the Sanhedrin. According to this, a convert could be part of the Sanhedrin, the highest court that essentially governed the Jewish people. Now, here it says there's a Sanhedrin now, during the time of the wilderness. The Sanhedrin, in case you can, you might be able to see it in the word, it's a Greek word. Sanhedrin literally means the place of convocation, of coming together. And in this case, for justice, the Sanhedrin it's a Greek word that became part of Judaism around the time of the Greco-Roman, early Greco-Roman period, maybe 200, 300 BCE, where Jews started having a court that would help decide matters of justice for the Jewish people, and that there was essentially one Sanhedrin and then a series of lower courts as well, lower justices, but the Sanhedrin was the main one. There is, of course, a huge debate of when the Sanhedrin stopped their work, because, of course, this gets to Christian history and whether Jesus was, according to the Christian Bible, was called in front of the Sanhedrin for charges against the Jewish people, essentially ones of blasphemy and, being accused of claiming that he was the Messiah. We don't know that there was a Sanhedrin. I would say more strongly, we don't think there was any Sanhedrin in effect during the Roman period. By the time of Jesus, there wasn't a functioning Sanhedrin that we ever hear about. But it didn't mean that the rabbis didn't want there to be a Sanhedrin. It didn't mean that they didn't dream of a Sanhedrin. They projected it backwards. Did they project it forwards? Probably hoped that it would be in effect again, but the Romans didn't allow the Jews to have a court that would function the way the Sanhedrin did during its golden years, where it was essentially the court of the land. It was the high court. It was the supreme court. So there was a window from about 200, maybe 250 BCE to probably about 50 or 60 BCE, where the Sanhedrin functioned as a real court. rabbis, priests, not just rabbis, but priests who were in it, who were involved in it, and helped the Jewish people have justice. So it was a functioning entity, but it was not, by the time probably of Jesus, any more a functioning entity that again would have been convened, and definitely wouldn't have been convened during Passover, during Pesach, as the Christian Bible attests. So it's probably again an error, but again, the Midrash has this idea that the Sanhedrin was in effect right now with Yitro's courts. And again, nobody called it. It's not called a Sanhedrin in the Torah. It's not called a Sanhedrin in the desert, in the wilderness, and it's not. We don't even have it during the time of King David. Though the rabbis also say that there was a Sanhedrin during King David's time, we don't have any. The Bible doesn't say it, and there's no evidence that there was a Sanhedrin until again the Jewish people returned from Babylonian exile and have kind of a autonomous court that the Persians allow them to run. So it is interesting, though, to see that Yitro is so desired, so wanted. So what is Yitro going to say to Moses to possibly get him off his back?
Yitro replied, "A candle may glow in the dark, but not when the sun and the moon. Of what avail would my candlelight be? I have therefore better return to my home city, that I may make proselytes of its inhabitants, instruct them in the Torah, and lead them under the wings of the Shekinah." Amid great marks of honor and provided with rich gifts, Yitro returned to his home, where he converted his kinsmen and his compatriots to the belief in the true God as he had intended.
Interesting. So Yitro goes back to Midian, but as a missionary. Very interesting, because again, not something that you would expect Jewish people to encourage or say today, or maybe starting to a little bit today, but during the early rabbinic period, very much so, the rabbis encouraged and had no issue with people going out attracting converts to Judaism. And so Yitro going back to Midian and saying that this is what he's going to do is, again, they say he was successful at it. His argument is, what do you need me for? You guys are all great lights. You won't notice me, but if I go back to my place, I can be a light to the nations. I can be a light to them. And so let me do my work there. And it's an interesting idea that Yitro, to some extent, is a missionary, a Jewish missionary to the Midianites. We know that during the rabbinic period, the early rabbinic period, the Jews were missionizing people. They were going around, and even the Christian Bible talks about the fact that Jews were actively seeking and actively converting people to Judaism. The Christian Bible says it makes fun of Jews who are doing this to some extent. Of course, it's ironic because they're going to be doing it pretty soon themselves, but they make fun of Jews going around converting people to Judaism in the Greco-Roman world during that, again, that early rabbinic period. There definitely seems to be differences of opinion on it, right? Because Rabbi Hillel, we have this wonderful story of Rabbi Hillel encouraging people to come to Judaism, and his adversarial colleague Shammai chasing people away who want to come in. So there doesn't seem to be uniformity on it necessarily within Judaism, within the rabbis, but there definitely seems to be the norm, which is Hillel represents normative Judaism. Shammai is more of the exception, if you will. The normative Judaism of the rabbinic period seems to be, let's get as many people coming on board as possible. So that's what Yitro does, according to the Midrash. The Torah doesn't say that. The Torah says he went home. That's what the Torah says. He went home. But the Midrash can't have that because he can't just go home. He can't go back and be back to normal after what he just did, after what he just experienced, after hearing about all the things that God did. And he seems to get it. So then that leads to the question, well, if he did this, if Yitro was successful at bringing people and becoming a Jewish emissary, if you will, what then happened to his people? What happened to the converts that Yitro made?
The descendants of Yitro later settled in Palestine, where the fruitful land of Jericho was allotted to them as a dwelling place. After the capture of Palestine, the tribes, by mutual consent, agreed that the fertile strip of land at Jericho should fall to the share of the tribe on whose land the temple was to be erected. But when its erection was postponed for a long time, they agreed to allot this piece of land to Yitro's sons, because they, being proselytes, had no other possession in the Holy Land. 480 years did the descendants of Yitro dwell in Jericho, when, upon the erection of the temple at Jerusalem, they relinquished it to the tribe of Judah, who had claimed it as an indemnity for the site of the temple.
So this is a weird discussion of where did Yitro's descendants wind up, which again, well, there's a problem in that they're not mentioned as a tribe. They're not given a tribal status, but there does seem to be in the Torah discussions of Midianites, or people specifically Kenites, they're called, who are not Israelites, who are given territory within the land of Israel. So, according to this tradition, they lived in Jericho, which is, as people who are kind of familiar, who've been to Israel and who are familiar with the geography of Israel, is down by the Jordan River. It is, it's an area where rivers drain down from the mountains into that area, and some of them go into the Dead Sea, and it's a very fertile area. It's an oasis type place in the Jordan Valley, which is very, very low. As you remember, that's the lowest place on the face of the earth. We're talking about 1,700 square feet, 1,700 feet below sea level. It's a very, very dry and arid place and very unusual place, but it's also Jericho, a very fertile place. And so the interesting thing here, the takeaway, is that Yitro's descendants got that area to live in. That's their place that they get to live in. And when the rabbis wrote this Midrash, it was still a very, very desirable place. Jericho today is, it's in the West Bank. It's in the territory, Palestinian territories, however you want to refer to it. It is entirely controlled by the Palestinian people. It is an area where you have to kind of have special permission to go there and to see some of the tourist sites in Jericho. Jericho citizens would love to have their areas opened up for tourism. And as we talked about, and you can see when we drive to Jericho on our trips, there's a huge casino hotel that was built there and was in operation for a few years because it was going to be essentially the San Manuel or the Chumash casino for Israelis, because casino gambling is not allowed in Israel, but it is allowed in Palestinian territories. And the idea was, it was built in conjunction with Israelis and Palestinians, that Jericho would be a place for, if you will, gambling, legalized gambling. And it was there in Israel, in Israel's wider territory, and it would allow Israelis to gamble legally. When the second intifada started in 2000, it closed. And so this dream of having a Palestinian Israeli economy that would help both, that example is kind of the building is an example to what could have been. So it's interesting that this Midrash takes us back to the fact that this is very desirable land. We also, by the way, read about in Josephus the fact that Cleopatra, there were several Cleopatras, but that Cleopatra, the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra, fought a war over maintaining Jericho as Egyptian territory with the Greco-Romans that were in Israel. She wanted to maintain Jericho because it was such a fertile area for palm trees and for perfumes, and that area was a very lucrative base of trade. Cleopatra really wanted to maintain Jericho. So it's not just a deserty place like you sometimes see it today. It's actually was always throughout history a very desirable place. So that's why it's a great thing that Yittro's descendants get Jericho, or at least for a long time they get it. And they, according to this, they deserved it.
Yittro's descendants inherited his devotion to the Torah, like him, dedicating their lives entirely to its study. So long as Joshua lived, they sat at this master's feet. But when he died, they said, "We left our fatherland and came here only for the sake of studying the Torah. If we were now to spend our time in cultivating the soil, when should we study the Torah?" They, therefore, gave up their dwelling place in Jericho and moved to the cold, barren wilderness to Jabez, who there had his house of instruction. But when they there beheld the priests, the Levites, and the noblest of the Jews, they said, "How can we, proselytes, presume to sit beside these?" Instead of sitting within the house of instruction, they remained at the entrance of it, where they listened to the lectures and in this manner made further progress in the study of the Torah. They were rewarded for their piety. Their prayer was heard by God, and their good deeds served as a protection to Israel. And on account of their pious actions, they were called the families of the scribes, the Tirathites, the Shemaatites, and the Sukkatites, names designating their piety and devotion to the Torah.
Yeah. Oh, why don't you read that last paragraph?
One of the descendants of Yitro was Yonadab, son of Rechab, who, when he heard from a prophet that God would destroy the temple, bade all his children as a token of mourning to drink no wine, use no oil for anointing themselves, nor cut their hair, nor dwell in houses. The Rechabites obeyed this command of their sire, and as a reward for this, God made a covenant with them that their descendants should always be members of the Sanhedrin and teachers of Israel. The covenant with the Rechabites was even stronger than that with David, for to the house of the latter, God promised to keep the covenant only if his descendants were pious, but he made an unconditional covenant with the Rechabites. God rewarded them for their devotion to him in this way, although they did not belong to the Jewish nation. From this, one can gather how great would have been their reward if they had been Israelites.
Yep. So this gets to this weird discussion of what happens to Jethro's descendants. And the Bible talks about a group of people called Kenites. I mentioned before, Kenites are Midianites, a group of Midianites who they're not Israelites. They're not of the 12 tribes, but they continue to live in the land of Israel as I mean, according to the Bible, I mean, they live as Jews, but they're not, or Israelites. They worship God, but they're not of the 12 tribes. And so there are traditions that these Rechabites, and again, there's like, if you read kind of esoteric Christian writings, Rechabites, will, like Jehovah's Witness texts and millenarious texts in America, Rechabites are kind of like people who dwell apart but are very holy, but aren't like part of the group. And according to tradition, the Rechabites didn't drink wine. They didn't drink, according to the Torah, they didn't drink wine. And they kind of are a little bit like the Nazarites in that they are observing laws that are not necessarily Torah laws, but are like they're trying to be really pure, almost like monks. And so they're somewhat mysterious because the Bible refers to them and seems to like know who we're talking about, but we don't really know. We don't know enough about them to really know how they lived and like who they were. But they are kind of, mystical, special people, if you will. And again, according to tradition, they're kind of like a holy people unto themselves. And so they follow the Torah, they follow Jewish law, but they're not Jews. And there have been people like this throughout time. And so there's a real question of like, can one be Jewish without being part of the Jewish people? And because they seem to consciously make this effort to retain their own ethnic identity. And so there's this real weird kind of like, well, why don't they just become Jewish? They can marry within everybody. I mean, they're proselytes. I mean, they could become like everybody else, but they don't. And so there is this idea that there are people who retain an identity that's not Jewish, or again, ethnically Jewish, but religiously Jewish. We really haven't had anything like this that we can like say, well, there's an analogy to this until recently. And now in the last couple hundred years, we've had some groups that have kind of done this. And, some of them haven't kind of crossed all the way into Judaism. And so they've kind of like, they're either still Christian, like Seventh-day Adventists who decided, no, we want to keep Shabbat. We want to not eat pork. We're going to do some of the Jewish traditions, but we still believe in Jesus. But there are other groups like the Subbotniki, which were a Russian group of 7-day keepers. And the Subbotniki really kind of became Jewish, were persecuted by the Russians, in some cases married into the Jewish community. That's how we kind of know that they were kind of not like this in the sense that they wanted to marry in. But we do have groups now in the United States that are called Noahides, and Noahides are saying that they want to retain kind of their non-Jewish status, but they don't believe in Jesus. They are believing in God. They want to keep Jewish law, but they're not becoming Jewish. And we now have these groups, predominantly again in the South, Tennessee, Virginia, Carolinas, that are they've been covered. I mean, people have written stories. I mean, I've talked to some of them. These are people who are in many ways still living kind of almost a fundamentalist life. In some cases, like Rechabites, not drinking alcohol or kind of doing certain things to keep themselves different, but trying to follow the Torah. So there are analogies to the Rechabites today, to the Kenites, to these groups. But for so long, I mean, there was no group that would like willingly take on Jewish tradition and then not become a Jew. So starting to see it again. This is not, there are modern analogies to this now. So the rabbis are still a little taken aback by it, which is why you have that line. From this, one can gather how great would have been their reward if they had been Israelites, because they're really good. They follow all the rules, they do everything else, but yet they don't want to become part of us. So that's why they get that final line there about them, which is, how great would it have been if they had been Israelites? So, but they are rewarded. And so there is, I'm just reading right now, there is an independent order of Rechabites, a fraternal organization and friendly society founded in England in 1835 that is part of a wider temperance movement to promote the total abstinence from alcoholic beverages. So there were Rechabites even in our country. In 1842, there was about 1 million Rechabites here in the United States. Doesn't seem like they were keeping Torah, but they were not drinking alcohol. So that was considered to be a very important commitment during the temperance movement, which is, we just talked about this the other day, was a political movement that affected many areas. We talked about it last week in Parshat Shmini, about the law that priests are not supposed to drink when they're doing their stuff. Judaism's always had a kind of a weird idea that, again, alcohol is fine. Don't do it when you're doing your job, your spiritual jobs. But there have been people like Nazarites and Rechabites and other groups that have said, no, we're not drinking at all. And Judaism has had, not necessarily that view, but been very big in some places, including our own country. As we said, that the temperance movement was a political force in this country that had a huge effect on, as we mentioned the other day, on suffrage, the suffrage movement, the abolition movement. It affected so many spheres of politics that it was a political force that we kind of don't even understand, have no context for anymore. It's not like the legalization of marijuana issue, which has been big, but nothing like the temperance movement in our country. So we're going to get a little bit closer now to Mount Sinai. And this is the last section that we're going to read, these last paragraphs here, or these paragraphs here. This will be the last parts that we read before we get to next week, the Midrash on Mount Sinai. So here we're going to read about what it's like to get ready for Mount Sinai. Oh, so Francine asked, what about them being from family of scribes? Again, nothing holier than that. Being a scribe during the rabbinic period was about the highest job you could have. Being a scribe is, rabbis, some of them were scribes, some of them weren't, but being a scribe was copying down Torah and just teaching Torah and knowing the Torah. It's all the best you could have. So that's what these people were. These were really, really good people. All right, so we're not quite there yet, but close.
Moses sent his father-in-law Yitro back to his home shortly before the revelation on Mount Sinai. He thought, when God gave us a single commandment of the Torah in Egypt, the Passover, he said, there shall no stranger eat of it. Surely Yitro may not look on when God bestows on us the whole Torah. Moses was right. God did not want Yitro to be present at the revelation. He said, Israel was in Egypt, bound to work with clay and bricks at the same time as Yitro was sitting at home in peace and quiet. He who suffers with the community shall share in their future joys, but he who does not share the sufferings of the community shall not take part in their rejoicing.
So that's an interesting, we just read all this wonderful midrash about Yitro and his descendants and all the good things that happened because of Yitro. And now we have, he had to go back. This is the other side, which is he had to go back. Yitro did not suffer like we did in Egypt. He missed that suffering. And so because he didn't suffer, he doesn't get to rejoice. Very interesting idea, which is, he's a good guy. Everybody understands he means well. But he didn't experience this suffering. And I think that there is a sense of, we understand what the rabbis mean by this, right? We understand that people who experience suffering in one way, and once they've gone through that suffering, they're changed. And not only that, they're due to some extent some compensation for that. So for him to partake in the compensation without having gone through it isn't fair. Look, you can make the argument these are the rabbis trying to, have it both ways. But there is something to be said for that understanding as well, which is, why should someone who didn't experience this now get to experience that? And we see that all the time with people who say, look, somebody who, there's minor versions of this, but the person who's been on the team for 10 years while the team suffered through horrible years of problems, and then somebody joins the team that year and gets the World Series ring. Yeah, people, there's some resentment, like, what, this guy wasn't here for the last 10 years and didn't have to be, didn't have to suffer through the losing times. Nowadays, by the way, that doesn't happen as much because people usually aren't on a team for more than 2 or 3 years anyways. But I think there was a time when people would say, where's that guy come along getting a ring? But there is a feeling that people oftentimes have, which is, the person didn't earn it. They didn't earn this reward, if you will. And I think that there's a legitimate issue, by the way, that some people have raised about, for example, reparations in this country, that, what if somebody is Black and a Black American, but doesn't have ancestors who were slaves? The argument would be, of course, they've suffered because of discrimination, might be suffering right now because of real discrimination, but they didn't come here as a slave. Their ancestors didn't come here as a slave, and they didn't suffer as a slave, for generations. And so would they be entitled to reparations?
I wonder about what if you've been living as a white person for generations and it turns out you have one drop?
Listen, there was people who made who brought out the fact that, Obama didn't, his family were, his father was from Africa.
Right.
His mother's family actually, according to, again, this was like history. Her family has slave owners in their background, right? So the irony is that this Black president we had of our country actually has a more complicated history than one would think, and would based on most considerations, even though he suffered from racism in his life, as he's talked about, the reality is he wouldn't maybe be entitled to reparations.
You wonder about the people who, there's a lot of Black people, obviously, who have slaveholding ancestors.
Yep.
And it would be absurd to make them pay reparations to themselves.
Yeah, maybe they'd say that's a wash, right?
Right.
But it is complicated, and there's a complicated, there's a complicated legacy. But in this case, it only happened, a few months ago we were slaves, right? So here it's very obvious, and it's like, again, that person, I would use more of the sports team analogy, which is not nearly as serious, but there is this understanding that what does this cat get to be part of our celebration? He didn't do anything. He just got here. And look, there are people who just are at the right place at the right time. And it's human nature to say, they're not entitled to this. And there are people who feel bound by the fact that they suffered together, and that they again, this was an issue, by the way, I will tell you in all seriousness, this was an issue in the modern nation of Israel, where people who lived during the War of Independence and who fought in the War of Independence and who suffered during those years in the 1940s, there was a certain resentment to the people who came later who benefited from it and who didn't have to suffer. And again, there was actually a tension between the the predominantly Ashkenazi Jewish population, and then the Sephardic or Mizrahi population that came from the Arab countries, who came after that. And the Ashkenazi argument was, well, they weren't here for the suffering. Their families didn't come out of concentration camps and fight for the nation of Israel. And the Mizrahi argument was, what are you talking about? We lost our homes and everything because once Israel was established, Iraq and Syria threw us out. We were victims of anti-Semitism, and there were Jews that were killed in those countries in the late 40s, early 50s. And we lost we had nowhere to go. Even if we wanted to stay, we couldn't have stayed because of Israel. So there was like these competing sufferings that were legitimately real, and we're only talking 60, 70 years ago. So this is not ancient history for us. We've actually lived through this recently. I mean, there's still people walking the earth, very much so, that are now in their 70s and 80s and 90s who were part of this argument, were part of this issue. But there was a feeling like, these people are surviving on our living on our struggle. And of course, we have this generationally all the time in countries where people say, look, you didn't suffer through the Depression, you didn't suffer through a war, you didn't suffer through these things, and yet you're here. You even to their own kids, you don't know what suffering is. You've lived a very comfortable life, and yet you didn't suffer. So this is the lesson, if you will, from Yitro, which is, again, he's a wonderful man, but he didn't suffer. So this is the other side of it. That was the other side of it, if you will. But here we go.
God had not only good cause to delay the giving of the Torah until after the departure of Yitro, but the time he chose to bestow it was also chosen for a good reason. Just as a female proselyte or a woman freed from captivity or an emancipated slave may not enter wedlock before she has for 3 months lived as a free Jewess, so God also waited 3 months after the deliverance of Israel from the bondage and the slavery of Egypt before his union with Israel on Mount Sinai. God, furthermore, treated his bride as did that king who went to the marriage ceremony only after he had overwhelmed his chosen bride with many gifts. So did Israel first receive manna, the well, and the quails, and not till then was the Torah granted them. Moses, who had received this promise when God had first appeared to him, that is, when you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain, waited most longingly for the promised time, saying, when will this time come to pass? When the time drew near, God said to Moses, the time is at hand when I shall bring about something entirely new.
So this then gets to the question of, why did it take a few months for the Israelites to get the 10 Commandments? Okay, because again, according to the Torah, it isn't until they're here at this moment that they're able to get the 10 Commandments. So they have to wait. It says specifically in the Torah that when they got the 10 Commandments, it was the third new moon after the Israelites had gone forth. That's the way chapter 19 begins. So we're at chapter 19, and it says, on the third new moon after the Israelites had gone forth from Sinai, from the land, gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day they entered the wilderness of Sinai. So the rabbis point out this really interesting law in the Torah, which is that when a woman, and it's in the Torah portion Ki Teitzei in Deuteronomy, that a woman has to be able to adjust to her new surroundings, if you will, if she's taken in battle. And a woman, by the way, has to essentially be given if she's taken in marriage, she's essentially, again, being brought into the people, and says specifically she's allowed to bewail her situation. She's allowed to kind of adjust, if you will. Here, of course, it's also a celebration. And the rabbis oftentimes compare Mount Sinai to a wedding, to the marriage of the Jewish people to the Torah at Mount Sinai. And so here it's also like a wedlock in that the marriage, there's going to be gifts, there's going to be the manna and the quail are gifts, and this is their marriage. So they drew a comparison between these, and kind of implied in this is that the Israelites needed to be ready for this new arrangement. They needed to be ready. They needed some time to adjust to their new circumstances. They couldn't get the Torah right away. They had to adjust. They had to move into this new space. And as we know, it oftentimes takes even longer, which is why the Israelites now then spend another generation of 40 years period adjusting to it, because that generation turns out to not be ready for this relationship, if you will. But God gives them a little time, maybe again, based on the fact that people need a 3-month or so adjustment period, a quarter, if you will, to be in their new circumstances.
This new miracle of which God spoke was the healing of all the sick among the Jews. God had wanted to give the Torah to the Jews immediately after the exodus from Egypt, but among them were found many that were lame, halt, or deaf. Wherefore, God said, the Torah is without a blemish. Hence would I not bestow it on a nation that has in it such as are burdened with defects. Nor do I want to wait until their children shall have grown to manhood, for I do not desire any longer to delay the delight of the Torah. For these reasons, nothing was left him to do but to heal those afflicted with disease. In the time between the exodus from Egypt and the revelation on Mount Sinai, all the blind among the Israelites regained their sight. All the halt became whole, so that the Torah might be given to a sound and healthy people. God wrought for that generation the same miracle which he will hereafter bring about in the future world, when the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped, the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongues of the dumb sing. Not only physically was this generation free from blemishes, but spiritually too. It stood on a high plane, and it was the combined merits of such a people that made them worthy of their high calling. Never before or after lived a generation as worthy as this of receiving the Torah. Had there been but one missing, God would not have given them the Torah, for he lays up wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler to them that walk uprightly.
Yeah, not exactly.
Not the same people who worship the golden calf, right?
No, I know. I wasn't going to say that. That you're absolutely right, Rosemary. I do want to point out, I was going to point out that this is not the most politically correct
Right.
reflection on infirmities, and
Yes.
we don't even use the word disability anymore. This is
Differently able people.
yeah, this is not
Mhm.
again the reflection on the way we see people today, though the Torah does to some extent understand that again, priests who have physical impairments, if you will, and again things like and again here it calls them blemishes, but they're defects, the other word that's used here. By the word halt means to limp. It's another kind of word that we don't use anymore for limping. But yeah, people with those types of situations were not allowed to be priests. They still could partake in the offerings, but they couldn't offer them. So there's this understanding that again, that people needed to be in a perfect physical state in order to receive the Torah. And so God heals everybody. So I mean, I'm not going to make an excuse for it, but I guess I am, which is that the vision of, there's a Jewish vision that people are cured of illness and cured of any deformity and defect, if you will, to use their words. That it's not the way people, it's not the way people are supposed to be. So let's make them physically whole. Look, I mean, there are people in this country today who are advocating, as some of you know, for people who have, again, see them as different abilities, that people shouldn't, wear hearing aids or have their physical situation be corrected, if you will. They don't want to see it corrected. There's a consciousness on deafness in this country where it shouldn't be seen as a disability at all. So there is that sense here of in the Bible and in Jewish tradition, in the Midrash, that when God creates the world to come, that people are not in any situation. They have no situation where they're not in perfect form. So this is where it comes from. I mean, again, I'm not making excuses. I'm putting it into the context of what it was intended, which was that this should be again, the way people ideally were created in their perfect form. It's something to think about. And by the way, that being said too, as people are considering things that are some of the great pieces of film that have come out recently, I definitely direct people to Crip Camp on Netflix. If you haven't seen it yet, it's worth watching, not once, but twice. It's that good.
Spell it.
Crip Camp, CRIP Camp, Crip Camp. Interestingly, my daughter Dina was just assigned this to watch for her education. She's finishing up her master's in education right now, thankfully, and she was just assigned this to watch by her professor, one of her professors, because it deals primarily with the educational reform that was brought about by people who went to this one camp in upstate New York, and it was started by the Jewish community. It definitely is the undercurrent, and this is about how Jewish Americans led the fight for protection for people who needed to have special help in their education services. 504 plans, and the people who made this the law in America were primarily American Jews. So it's a pretty powerful. I mean, I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. So it is it's a really powerful documentary, and I will say that it'll make you very proud to be a Jewish American. So it is, if you will, it's the takeaway from what Judaism has also fought for, as we said, from the very beginning of today, which is justice. So ADA laws and educational considerations. I wish Sandy Keaton isn't on the line today, who spent her career as an audiologist in LA Unified for decades. But this is a really important issue for us as Jews. And again, has anybody seen Crip Camp? I mean, has anybody seen it? Nobody? Man, it is for every for everything that you're embarrassed that you watched on Netflix, over the last 12 months, 13 months. If you watch Crip Camp, all will
Absolutely.
be forgiven. No, I
To
you
say,
will
clears the slate, clears the
you will
slate.
walk away feeling I am not a piece of trash. I am not, I have some worth because I watched something.
Trip camp.
I
Okay.
I used my mind for something holier than Tiger King. I
Never watched.
I will tell you, I challenge
Indulge.
I challenge you to watch it without crying, but I also will tell you that you will be very proud to be an American Jew after you read it, after you watch it. So I'm trying to get, actually, once we're able to come back together, I'm trying to get some of the people that were involved in it to come to talk a little bit about it and their fight, their struggle. Some of them are local to in California, and actually one of my friends, Bruce Berger, who's also known as the musician Rebbe Soul, his mother was one of the founders of the camp in upstate New York. The camp was in the Catskill areas, and it only lasted about 10 years, but the effect that it had on the young people who went there is just overwhelming. So anyways, that is the other side of this. So when you read the Midrash and kind of go, well, what do you mean everyone's going to get healed and they couldn't get the Torah unless they were healed? What kind of thing is that? I will tell you that in practice, synagogues in the Jewish community have gone overboard, and gone, maybe not overboard because you can't go overboard, but have done everything they can to be inclusive. And it's one of the reasons why we did the Jewish Disability Inclusion Awareness and Inclusion service back in February, because again, it's something that's definitely part of our consciousness and part of our need for justice. So the reality is that, not that everybody has to be whole in order to get the Torah, folks. All right, let's continue.
For one other reason did God delay the revelation of the Torah. He had intended giving them the Torah immediately after their exodus from Egypt. But at the beginning of the march through the desert, great discord reigned among them. Nor was harmony established until the new moon of the third month, when they arrived at Mount Sinai. Whereupon God said, "The ways of the Torah are ways of loveliness, and all its paths are paths of peace. I will yield the Torah to a nation that dwells in peace and amity." This decision of God now to give them the Torah also shows how mighty is the influence of penance. For they had been sinful upon their arrival at Mount Sinai, continuing to tempt God and doubting his omnipotence. After a short time, however, they changed in spirit, and hardly had they reformed when God found them worthy of revealing to them the Torah.
Yeah. Well, as Rosemary already said, the window of opportunity for them getting the Torah was very small. It was not a long one. Look, we have a tradition that, we kind of have to be of the right, you got to be of the right frame of mind to study Torah. You have to be deserving of Torah. It's in the book of Proverbs that we read that the ways of the Torah are peace. God wanted us to be people committed to shalom, keeping to peace, keeping people getting along. That's the way you deserve to get the Torah. So originally, when they come out, he wanted to give it to them right away. God wanted the people to have the Torah as soon as they left Egypt. They weren't ready. They were too argumentative. They were argumentative amongst themselves and argumentative with Moses, and they're just not ready. So after a little time, they were. And as Rosemary pointed out, they go back to not being so good. But there's this window of opportunity where they're ready to get the Torah. So this begs the question, why did they get it right away? Why do we have to wait? Why do we have to wait 3 months to get the Torah? We weren't ready. And again, there was a window. So why else did they get it?
The third month was chosen for the revelation because everything that is closely connected with the Torah and with Israel is triple in number. The Torah consists of three parts: the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the writings. Similarly, the oral law consists of Midrash, Halakha, and Haggadah. The communications between God and Israel were carried on by three: Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Israel also is divided into three divisions: priests, Levites, and laymen, and they are furthermore the descendants of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For God has a preference for the third. It was the third of Adam's sons, Seth, who became the ancestor of humanity, and so too it was the third among Noah's sons, Shem, who attained high station. Among the Jewish kings, too, it was the third, Solomon, whom God distinguished before all others. The number three plays a particularly important part in the life of Moses. He belonged to the tribe of Levi, which is not only the third of the tribes, but has a name consisting of three letters. He himself was the third of the children of the family. His own name consists of three letters. In his infancy had been concealed by his mother throughout 3 months, and in the third month of the year, after a preparation of 3 days, did he receive the Torah on a mountain, the name of which consists of 3 letters.
Yeah, so lots of threes. Were the rabbis aware of the Trinity? I don't know. But they look, I mean, this is not at that level. There's just a lot of threes that are big, including the name Levi, which is 3 letters, the name Moshe, which is 3 letters. It's not coincidental. A lot of names in Hebrew are 3 letters. A lot of words in Hebrew are 3 letters because every Hebrew root word is a shorus. Exactly, Judah. It's 3 letters. So the fact that there's 3 letters, I mean, you could actually, but they didn't think about it in those ways because they're not linguistic scholars and they didn't talk about the shorashim, the roots. But yeah, technically you could say, hey, every Hebrew word comes out of 3 letters. He didn't say that.
And there's probably a lot of disgusting things that have 3-letter names too.
Sure. So it's everything. It's 3. But according, there's 3 patriarchs. There's things that are obvious. That Moses is the 3rd child. Noah has 3 sons. Shem is, well, according to some lists, by the way, Shem is not the 3rd son, is the 1st son, but it doesn't matter. The reality is that there are a lot of 3s. And that Sinai is written oftentimes with 3. It can also be written with 4, but usually written with 3, I guess, 3 letters. So there's 3 threes. There's a lot of them. Some of them are not obvious, and some of them are more kind of like, I guess you could say, more opinion. But I, again, Saul, David, and then Solomon, you're basically saying the 3rd king, they got it right. Though I could make the argument that Solomon is not necessarily a better king than his father David, and we don't call them descendants of Solomon. We call them descendants of David. I mean, some of them are maybe a little open to that. There are 3 books of the Bible: the Torah, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings, which he translates as hagiographa, which is the writings, the holy writings. There really are more than 3 sections of oral law, or different ways of looking at it. They have Midrash, Halakha, and Haggadah, which is kind of an interesting division of how you come up with it. But so these are 3s, and so 3 is significant. These are 3 is a magic number, as they say in Schoolhouse Rock. It is the number 3, the power of 3, if you will. By the way, that interesting one about Seth, which is interesting because Adam's other 2 sons, Cain and Abel, they don't make it, right? Seth is, we don't talk a lot about him, but he's the 3rd child. Now, we're going to finish up today with some of the most famous midrash on the Torah, about the Torah, some of the most famous midrashim in all of midrash, in the sense that you may have heard these before, and if you haven't heard them, they are definitely operational midrashim that the rabbis refer to in lots of places, not just when they're talking about this moment at Mount Sinai, but in general, in the sense that these are oftentimes taken out of context. And of course, this gets to the bigger question: why the Jews? Why did God want the Jews to have the Torah? Why doesn't everybody have the Torah? I mean, if the Torah is God's work, then shouldn't everybody have the Torah? And so the Midrash will get into this discussion right now, which is why the Gentiles don't have the Torah. So again, you may have heard some of this before because it's oft quoted Midrash on why the Gentiles don't have the Torah.
The mountain on which God made his revelation bears 6 names. It is called the desert Sin because God there announced his commandments. It is called the desert Kadesh because Israel was sanctified there. The desert Kadmut because the pre-existing Torah was there revealed. The desert Paran because Israel there was greatly multiplied. The desert Sinai because the hatred of God against the heathens began there for the reason that they would not accept the Torah. And for this same reason, it is called Horeb, because the annihilation of the heathens was there decreed by God. For the wrath,
Keep on, sorry.
for the wrath of God against the heathens dates from their refusal to accept the Torah offered them.
Yeah, so this is not good. This is not also politically correct in a sense. And again, this is actually a
Jingoistic.
yes, and this is actually an error. It should be Horeb, which you've seen before. It's referred, Mount Sinai is oftentimes referred to as Horeb. Horeb means sword. And it is violence, annihilation. And it's not good in the sense that it's called Horeb, Sinai from the word Sinai, or in Hebrew, the word sinat means hatred. So that's not good either. Horeb is violence, annihilation. This is actually a word in Arabic. It's actually very similar connotation, by the way, too, not just violence, but religious violence. There's a famous distinction that some of you have heard about in Islamic fundamentalist teaching, which is there are only 2 parts of the world that have already taken on the law of Islam, and those that have yet to take on the law of Islam, that have become Islamic, right? So areas that have become Islamic already are Dar al-Islam, the area of Islam. The other area is called Dar al-Harb, which means a land of violence, of annihilation, which is areas that you can go on violent jihad in order to create or make those people Muslim. So that distinction of 2 worlds, of 2 parts of the world, is oftentimes, we're reminded of that and are scared by that. And it is indeed scary. But I will tell you that there's a little touch of it right here, in the sense that not that you and I are allowed to go to war against the heathens for their refusal to accept the Torah, but the wrath of God, which means that God might go to war against those people who refuse to accept the Torah. So this kind of gives us this understanding that maybe God isn't happy that people didn't take the Torah. Now, you could say, well, look, we took the Torah and we did it, and that's really good for us. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is it's really not good that they didn't take the Torah. And there is that sense in the Midrash, which is that Jewish people were not like an exceptional people. I mean, it's kind of weird because we've read about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and our forefathers and all these promises, but there's also this kind of like reality check where Jews were like, we've never been a strong people. We're not a mighty, ancient people. And of course we are ancient people today, but back when we were an ancient people at the beginning, there were people that were more ancient than us, more powerful than us, pretty much everybody And so the Jews would look around going, why us? Why are we the people that get this? Again, the Torah itself would say, because of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because you're already closer to God. And now God's going to give you, now that you're a people, you're going to get the law. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, according to the rabbis, knew the law. They instinctively knew it. God gave them the law. It just literally, they knew it. Now the people need the law. But why just the Jews? Why only the Jews? What made us at this moment worthy of it? And so the rabbis tell this very famous midrash, which again, often quoted. This might be one of the more famous midrash. This goes up maybe again with the story of Abraham and the idols and his father. This might be up there as one of the most well-known midrashim that kind of get into our minds. Here we go.
Before God gave Israel the Torah, he approached every tribe and nation and offered them the Torah, that hereafter they might have no excuse to say, had the Holy One, blessed be he, desired to give us the Torah, we should have accepted it. He went to the children of Esau and said, will you accept the Torah? They answered him, saying, what is written therein? He answered them, you shall not kill. Then they all said, will you perchance take from us the blessing with which our father Esau was blessed? For he was blessed with the words, by the sword shall you live. We do not want to accept the Torah. Thereupon he went to the children of Lot and said to them, will you accept the Torah? They said, what is written therein? He answered, you shall not commit unchastity. They said, from unchastity do we spring. We do not want to accept the Torah. Then he went to the children of Ishmael and said to them, do you want to accept the Torah? They said to him, what is written therein? He answered, you shall not steal. They said, will you take from us the blessing with which our father was blessed? God promised him, his hand will be against every man. We do not want to accept the Torah. Thence he went to all the other nations, who likewise rejected the Torah, saying, we cannot give up the law of our fathers. We do not want the Torah. Give it to your people, Israel.
Okay, so let's pause right there with what we just read, which is that the Torah just God does offer it to other people, and all these other people don't want it because the things in the Torah, especially specifically again the Ten Commandments, they break all those laws. Not only do they break those laws, God seemed to allow them to break those laws. So it's not even just, oh, we don't want to do those things. They're almost saying, God, you told us we can do these things. So they actually almost challenged God with what God's already said, because God tells Ishmael that your hand is going to be on other people, or tells Hagar that her son will be maybe not stealing from everybody, it doesn't have to be that way, but fighting with everybody, and Esau, that he gets to fight, the Ammonites and Moabites are descendants of Lot having sex with his daughters. So they're like, what are you talking about? That we don't even exist unless that happens. So all of these kinds of things, the other nations say, well, you're actually getting to our very origins by taking this. If you can't take this stuff away, otherwise we don't exist. So it's not just these other people couldn't handle it. They're completely antithetical to Torah law. Their whole existence is based on not following Torah. So it's not simply they can't do it. No, they don't want to do it, or they can't, because they stop being who they are if they take on the Torah. That's the important takeaway from the Midrash, which is, oh, you mean if these other people follow the Torah, they don't even exist anymore. Takes away their existence. So the other nations pretty much all say to God, no, just give it to Israel. They're your people already anyways. So here's the last people the people that, always look at the last, always come back to your own people. Well, I mean, it seems like God, it was a setup, but here we go.
Upon this, he came to Israel and spoke to them. Will you accept the Torah? They said to him, what is written therein? He answered, 613 commandments. They said, all that the Lord has spoken will we do and be obedient. O Lord of the world, they continued, we acted in accordance with your commandments before they were revealed to us. Jacob fulfilled the first of the 10 commandments by bidding his sons put away strange gods that were among them. Abraham obeyed the commandment not to take the name of the Lord in vain, for he said, I have lifted up my hand to the Lord, the Most High God. Joseph fulfilled the commandment to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And when his brothers came to him, he had everything for their welcome prepared on Friday. Isaac observed the law to honor his father and mother when he allowed Abraham to bind him on the altar as a sacrifice. Judah observed the commandment not to kill when he said to his brothers, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Joseph observed the law, thou shalt not commit adultery, when he repulsed the desire of the wife of Potiphar. The other sons of Jacob observed the commandment, you shall not steal, saying, how then should we steal out of the Lord's house silver and gold? Abraham observed the commandment, you shall not bear false witness, for he was a true witness and bore witness before all the world that you are the God of all creation. It was Abraham also who observed the last of the 10 commandments, you shall not covet, saying, I will not take from a thread even to a shoelace.
So the rabbis actually point out here that the Jewish people have been keeping the 10 commandments all along. That they point to all these different parts of the pre-Exodus stories to show that they already were following it. You don't have to ask us, God. We've already been doing it, which is really interesting because it kind of begs the question, did the Jewish people really need the 10 commandments when they already knew them? So this is an idea that the rabbis like to play around with, if you will, they believe it, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph and those generations, they knew the law already. They didn't need to have the 10 commandments. They knew it. There was never a time for them that the laws weren't into effect. The Torah is eternal. And so if the Torah is eternal, there wasn't a time when Abraham didn't have the 10 commandments. He had them. The idea that Abraham didn't live by the 10 commandments is they can't absorb that. Because how could their holy ancestor, how could our holy ancestors not have the 10 commandments? I mean, some of the stuff is just, okay, there are examples of our ancestors following the 10 commandments. Nowhere in the Torah, though, does it say in the book of Genesis that Joseph put out a Shabbos meal for his brothers when he came to him. It says they prepared food. It doesn't say that he prepared him a Shabbos meal. The rabbis derived from that it was a Shabbos meal, but it doesn't say anywhere there that it was a Shabbos meal. But they basically show that all the 10 commandments were observed by the patriarchs and matriarchs, I guess. But it is really their attempt to say that we've always kept the 10 commandments. We've always had it. There was never a time we didn't have the 10 commandments. But of course, what we also hear is that it's not just 10 commandments. There are 613 commandments. They say to, when God says, will you accept the Torah? And we say to God, what's in them? And he says 613 commandments. They say Na'aseh v'nishma. We'll do and we'll listen, which, by the way, is the reverse of the way you think should be, which is I will listen and I will hear it. I'll do it. Here they actually say we'll do it and then we'll listen to it, which is the rabbis derive from that, as we're going to see, that wow, our ancestors were quite amazing because they didn't even ask what was in it. They just did it. They said, we'll do it. Tell it to us. not tell it to us and then we'll do it, which kind of implies maybe I'll change my mind after I hear what's in it. Like these other people who all ask, well, what's in it, God? Jews didn't do that. They did the opposite. They said, we'll do it. What's in it? Let's hear it. So again, it's a play on the words Na'aseh v'nishma, which is really the rabbinic trick here, which is saying, look at what we said. Look at what the Torah says we did. We said we'll do it before we even heard it. There's a later, much later Midrash, which I'm guessing comes from the last few decades, that goes, when God came to the Israelites and said, will you take the 10 commandments? Will you take the tablets? And they said, how much are they? And they said, God said, they're free. He said, we'll take 2. That is the modern Midrash, which is not, this is not true. Somebody, of course, embellished on stereotypes in that story, but
Got 'em for you wholesale.
we will finish up on a humorous note, which is our ancestors readily accepted the law. The rabbis recognized that took a lot of courage because it's much easier not to have law. It's much easier to say, no, we can't do that. Are you kidding me? We have to give up having sex with whoever we want to? I mean, we have to give up thieving and stealing from people? Absolutely not. And by the way, I mean, there are people who essentially had laws that allowed for them to do those kinds of things, as long as they did them to other people, right? You know, Vikings were very good at keeping laws within their own community oftentimes, but the no issue with taking them from everybody else. So this is an issue for us, that we pride ourselves on the fact that we're a people of the law and that we took it on willingly. And we will get to that next week. But what we're going to start with next week is a wonderful midrash on which mountain gets to have the 10 commandments, because Mount Sinai, according to tradition, is nothing special, but yet it gets to have the 10 commandments given. So that's what we're going to come back with next week. We're going to come back to the contest of the mountains, as it's titled. And again, the law coming to us, and some very famous midrashim, before we actually, probably next week, might just start with the actual 10 commandments being given to us. But again, thank you, Rosemary, for leading us and helping us read this section here today. We actually read probably enough to get to that section. And again, please stay strong, and again, it's great to have you back, Rosemary.
Well, thank you.
All right, everybody. Stay good and stay healthy, everyone. We will see you tomorrow night or next week. Take care. Bye-bye.